So when they kind of came to us with this question about how is technology transforming the art world, I think I lost my mind for a second. I kind of hit a bit of a paralysis because there are so many different perspectives, and that's been shown throughout the day, kind of in terms of how we consider that question, whether it's about individual and personal practice, whether it's about the kind of ethics and development of open source, whether it's that relation to contemporary practice. It's so overarching now in terms of, digital isn't a medium. Digital's a way of life. This is why I'd never get anywhere in advertising. It's kind of this overarching layer. So one thing that I realised is we had to think about this from the perspective in which we work. And Jenny talked about this a little bit, but I'm just going to kind of position it for you before I talk you through where the question took me. So like Jenny said, we're a creative and cultural agency, and we specialise in art in the public realm that uses technology for social impact and for social change. One of the most notable ways that we do this is through Frequency Festival of Digital Culture, which is a biannual festival in Lincoln that showcases new talent, international talent, plays based in non-traditional spaces. We do work with kind of galleries and institutional settings, but it's about expanding democratic audience engagement using digital and creative technologies as a force of good, whether that's expanding on kind of economic impact for plays outside of major cities, whether it's about social value, whether it's about investment into our talent development within the sector, or how we can kind of work with other sector organisations to create cultural experiences that have this social impact. And recently, we just delivered this project, which I'll come back to, called Digital Democracies, which was a 2-year R&D project about digital work in specifically outdoor spaces, all kind of driven by the same ethos about expanding this democratic audience experience. And this was led by a network of festivals, because we have this kind of specific perspective and relationship to public space. Someone said to me once that festivals are kind of like the extreme sports of the arts world. We're sort of a kind of grubby counterpart in there. We're the ones sort of running past you in cagoule and pulling things together, but it's a different experience in that sense. So what we did is we brought together Freedom Festival, which has an amazing reputation in outdoor work, Brighton Digital Festival, which is connected to that Southeast Southwest tech corridor, and also has a very evolving relationship with intersectional audiences, and then Frequency Festivals, which is underpinned by the spirit of radical inclusion, driving economic impact and social impact outside spaces. And we came together as a commissioning partnership to see what happened. Full disclosure, that happened during COVID, so there was a bit of a pandemic caveat to it. So one of the things that I'm going to talk about is when I was thinking about this relationship to digital technologies, or to digital practice, the first question that I asked myself was does digital practice exist? Yes. So we answered that one quite early on. See, you asked me this morning. But then also thinking as well about, actually what does this kind of digital practice mean? And for us, it's about, there's a multifaceted relationship to that. It's not just in terms of kind of the production of the work, but actually in the creation and the commissioning of the work as well. And as an organisation, taking learning from outside the creative and cultural sector has allowed us to adapt and refine some of the ways that we work. And notably, this is one of the things that we use. We use this research and impact model. And this was developed in relationship to commissioning, and whether it was in commissioning of work or kind of creation of public projects. But it was this test route that allowed us to design and develop projects that are kind of led by a social need, and then to challenge our way of working, to take that through a process that actually becomes more living and is closer to those digital processes. So what I thought I'd do with this is test it to the next level above and think, well, actually, can I use this to answer this question? And when I was doing this, I was like, if this doesn't work, I've got some issues, but it did help, because there were so many different kind of facets and forms that we were thinking of. And You what now?
You got your thing in the way of the question.
Sean Carroll,
Sorry.
always with me.
Does Sean?
But you're yeah, is that right?
Is that
It was right in front of a good bit,
Sorry.
wasn't it? So, actually, at this point of kind of empathising with what question I was asking myself and what that question actually meant to me is, does digital practice exist? Yes. And what does that integration of digital technology into practice kind of sort of mean? And then on top of that, given that digital practice has a relation to innovation is now operates on a rapid cycle. What does that mean for a development of practice if it's tied to something that innovates and generates on such a rapid turnover? And then layering that as well, you see why I had a bit of an existential crisis at this point. Layering that as well of thinking, well, we're creating practice linking to cycles of innovation. Cycles of innovation in other sectors is kind of being driven by new methods of collaboration. It's being driven by new methods and new ways of working that are maybe, in the technology sector more formally adopted, but is there learning and structure that we can take from those sectors to bring over into our practice that would actually enable us to think about the creation and development of work in a different way that's maybe perhaps more relevant for 21st century audiences? So, and then adding to our lens as well, we work with cultural activity and practice for social impact and for social change. So actually, thinking in terms of our core mission, thinking in terms of what we're working towards, how could this develop and help us? So that was the question that I started with. And then obviously you're starting with quite a large question, and then to follow that process through, what we then start to go into is, why won't it skip? Thank you. What we then started thinking is, like Sean mentioned earlier, there's two types of data. You've got quantitative data and you've got qualitative data, and there's values in both. And actually, when we start to think about developing projects, we think about what kind of quantitative data we can start from, where we can develop kind of like footfall information, where we can start to use baseline information to generate KPIs, to think about how we're hitting audiences, to think about how we're improving our relationship to EDI. There's a whole set of numerical data there that can allow us to understand where we're performing. But then within that as well, there's a qualitative data that shouldn't be ignored. And this is the observational, this is the conversational. So that was where, when I started thinking about this question and thinking about how to define this, it was in the kind of qualitative observations that I'd had over working with and then becoming director of a digital festival that operates on a 2-year cycle. So this is it in practice. And this is kind of a loose observation of, in terms of digital in public space, what I've kind of observed over the period. So when the festival started in 2011, there was a lot of emerging digital work, and especially thinking that we're curating from the perspective of, this is non-traditional space, this could be first-time cultural audiences, this is about creating points of access. There was a lot of work that, in terms of their relationship to the technology, it was very clever. It was new and emerging technologies, it was hacking that technologies, but there was a thing of kind of, if you think about it from a human-led and a user-led perspective, aesthetically, visually, what was that adding up to, and then how was that working within place? So in 2011, there was a lot of work that was kind of led by the technology over the experience. And then when the festival came back 2 years later, 2013 felt like the year of projections. I swear to God, I hired so many projectors for the festival that year, and ringing people just to find out where there were more. And it wasn't just projector and a screen. It was people who were kind of, pulling in content from CCTV camera to create generative artwork, people who were strapping projectors into pushchairs to create guerrilla projections across a city. It was going into large scale. It was it felt like such a heavy year of like light experimentation. And again, just like Antonio said, some of this is generalisation, so do feel free to agree with me. This is just my observations. And then in 2015, there was this really interesting shift that the work that we were curating and the work that was available, it's like artists were taking more of a handle on that technology. There was like an emergence of projection work that was using haptics, coding work that kind of led to interactive and immersive experiences. VR was kind of hitting more of a point, and I think as well that's where we started thinking more in terms of that kind of XR metaverse relationship. And I know the metaverse was pre-existing towards that, but in 2015 it really felt like we were shifting this digital relationship from a kind of subject-object to something that was a little bit more blurred in terms of the lines. And then that carried on into 2017, and what we were seeing in 2017 and 2019 were artists with the ability, and especially in terms of public space, to start interfacing with some of our digital infrastructure, to start using some of that kind of city digital infrastructure and to start utilising it in ways that were new and original and playful and allowed audiences to connect with it in a new way. So that 2015 period felt really important in terms of digital practice accelerating, hitting a real solid point of not only experimentation, experience, but also like more of an assimilation with audiences. We were seeing a different relationship with audiences as well, that they have this digital natives and digital understanding. And in 2019, we noticed that one area had kind of hit a bit of a wall, and that was specifically around outdoor work. And outdoor work had kind of hit this kind of ceiling where it had become very spectacle-based. It was kind of mirroring a lot of what we were seeing in entertainment venues. It was very large scale, it was very light-focused, it worked in terms of an evening economy, it was very costly to mount, it was very subject-object orientated. And in 2019, we realised there was a potential there to kind of exploit this a little bit more. There was more kind of open source. I keep pointing to you whenever I say open source, like the face of open source. There was more of this kind of accessible technologies being aware, but also we weren't exploiting that potential in terms of outdoor democratic public space as a way to build new audiences. And experimenting with kind of that intimacy of scale, and also thinking about the kind of cost of production, the cost of mounting. And then, spoiler alert, in 2020, that was when it got really pandemic-y. That was when we were just about to launch that project, and we went into lockdown. And then, I think from a cultural perspective, what I saw in lockdown was like a digital tsunami, just this massive shift of like, just put it online, just put everything online, take it to the internet. And that had a pressure on organisations, it had a pressure on artists, because a digital reach has to be constructed, it takes time, it takes work, and just throwing things out there negated some work that kind of been created because they've been created for a certain audience experience. It kind of flattened a lot of things. And also now we are user-generated content, we're also self-curating. We know our channels, we know our kind of entry points. I remember going to a talk in like 2005, 2006, and they said, at some point people are just going to be curators of their entire life. And we were like, oh, what's that look like? Mm-hmm. And they were talking about collaboration on the internet, and we were like, but what about IP? And then all of a sudden it's just had this shift. So anyway, in terms of defining this thing of like, what can digital technology do in terms of digital practice? These were all things that we were kind of considering. And then at this point where we were within this digital tsunami, we launched Digital Democracies. We're like, well, we're going to do it. It's a digital project. We can think about how we create the call-outs. We think about how we utilise the technologies. We can think about how we communicate with artists. And within the programme as well, we embedded, over the 2 years, masterclasses, tech talks, sandpits, prototyping because it allowed us to create this conversation with artists around their relationship to digital practice. And it was also seeking to work with artists who weren't necessarily working with digital technologies, and what do the needs of those artists look like. And from the experiences that we had, what we sort of found is that artists who weren't working with technology were more keen to collaborate than to adopt those skills. And actually that was the environment we needed to be setting up. And there was also this kind of sudden push, like this digital acceleration, because we could see this digital tsunami, we could see this kind of online disengagement. There were a lot of artists who were kind of supported to make their work digital. But what they weren't given is they weren't given any signposting. So they had a kind of no digital experience, they had a digital ambition. They would have 6 months, and it would take them 6 months to kind of identify and track down that they needed an animator. So again, there was this kind of need for collaboration in these new environments. If they were funded, like I could say, that development part was missing. And there was this other side as well of artists working with technology. We're finding it really hard to engage with kind of gallery, and I guess what we talk about is like traditional forms of practice or kind of more research-led practice, because these artists who were working with technology were kind of engaging with briefs and dealing with creation of work in a different way. It was much more sort of solutions focused. And we also found out that if you're going to work with digital, it really takes time. It does take time and research, and more often than not turning it on and off again. But we also found that even in these kind of times of restrictions, in terms of distance, there was still this potential and ability to use these technologies, to use these communities, and to use these networks to still kind of create and develop work with artists in a way that was meaningful. So again, in terms of how digital practice is transforming, this is kind of what I've seen over the last, between 2011, but most importantly kind of over the last couple of years. And in terms of thinking about how we answer this question, these are the things that we were seeing and we were defining. And so then I thought, the most important part of that question we're asking is, can this shape this emerging area of practice? We started talking about interconnected digital practice, a new network of interconnected digital practice, because we were actually finding in that collaboration required a number of people. It may require artists, technologists, but also there were relations to kind of HEI, to community, to new talent development. And we started thinking about how this, in terms of a commissioning framework and in terms of an organisation that seeks to create kind of social impact and social change, it's 5 minutes, I got you. This could be part of that. So from that, we started thinking of like, well, okay, so how does this look in real life? How does this look in terms of an application? So we started thinking in terms of making the call-outs that are underpinned by data, using that data to create call-outs for artists that had the kind of best chance of success. If you want to engage with this audience, it's in this space, it likely needs to be of this scale. So setting them kind of parameters that were built from the ground up in terms of data, but gave the artist the opportunity to kind of fill in that space of how we engage. We also learned as well that there's this new way of working where we have to think about iterations. It's not about a product that is then developed and then engaged with audiences. There's a thing about building from testing and iterating. And I was working with an artist who works in VR, and she said, well, it's really similar to the agile mindset. If you're using an agile methodology and you're thinking about building a car, you don't start straight from the point of view of having a car. You start from the idea of a skateboard. You know, it's got everything we need there. It can get me from A to B. Here's my starting point, and then at each stage of the scale, you're building and adding to that. So actually, what you can do with this digital work is you can make audiences part of your human-led design. Put it out there, test it, give them the skateboard, let them take it to, what comes after a skateboard, scooter? Fair. Let them kind of get it to that next stage. And then, actually, is there opportunity in this kind of commissioning and creation for social impact and social change that we can measure, but also that we were thinking about beyond exhibition, but actually can exist within the creation of work. And then also, in terms of ideation, we need to be thinking about how to create chances to experiment, how to give people a chance to get their hands on, like the new, like the open source new stuff, you know, like the platforms like something like Echoes XYZ, a geolocated audio platform that is now kind of free and available, that 5 years ago would cost thousands and potentially wouldn't work. But then also as well, where is their tech sitting, like in terms of HEO? How can artists become integral in that experimentation in terms of testing the parameters? So this is what kind of ideation starts to look like of what we think digital practice could look like going forward. That was such an expansive hand gesture, wasn't it? Caught in the moment, sorry. And then the final part of this is we have to test it. So this is what we're going to do, is we're going to think about in terms of our projects and our commissioning, these are going to be things that we're going to put into test. We're going to make sure that we listen to artists and audiences. We're going to maintain our live relationships to data. And we're going to think about defined outcomes with kind of qualitative and quantitative information that comes back at the end of each one, to iterate and to define and to keep going in terms of how we develop and how we move a festival for democratic engagement forward. And in terms of commissioning, thinking about these new commissioning frameworks, thinking about where we can test that, and also thinking about when we expand out this commissioning opportunity, who are the groups that we're inviting in and what are kind of the needs of those groups? Again, in Agile methodology, they have this role of someone who acts as a Scrum Master. And the Scrum Master's role is to keep an eye over the health, the well-being of those teams. And as producers, we have a two-way relationship that, one, we have to look internally at the well-being of the communities and the artists that we're working with, but we also have to kind of take that product manager approach, facing outward and liaise with stakeholders, make the case, share our impact. And, you know, we are hearing that in terms of metaverse spaces, in terms of virtual environments, there are issues around kind of marginalisations that we're mapping from our physical worlds onto our digital world. So there's another point there that we have to be aware of. And also, how are we kind of keeping the safety and the sanity of our collaborators? This is, in terms of digital practice, taking work at an R&D stage, or what we would consider an R&D stage. We've seen people have very extreme reactions to that, to not feel comfortable with that. But actually, you know, we're living more and more in a human-led society. How we interact with digital products, how we, you know, even how we use our kind of banking services, how we use our doorbells, that is all gathering information that is user-led that will shape and change the relationship of those future products. So is there a relationship in terms of that for digital practice? How am I doing? I've got one slide left, but I can skip it. And these were just my last bits. Like, these were the questions that I just had outstanding, or kind of the observations that I just had left that didn't fit into my presentation. One thing that digital is causing is a death to the binary in a number of different respects, whether it's kind of about the subject to the object, whether it's about, you know, the definition of kind of one or the other. What digital is, for me, the way I see it, is digital is kind of creating this space that doesn't sit now on the outside of the physical. When you think about that relationship to the metaverse, at one point the metaverse we thought about as virtual reality environments, maybe AR environments, but actually now the metaverse is kind of, every time you engage with that digital footprint, every time you create a digital twin of yourself, your Ring doorbell is connected to the metaverse. So actually that digital physical relationship, there's a phygital space in the middle, which is kind of emerging that we can't ignore. And this is also tied to rapid innovation, so like buckle up. In terms of where we're going, this is going to keep changing and going to keep accelerating. And in terms of digital practice, we shouldn't think that there's one fixed model. And a lot of time as well, when there's a tech relationship, tech is very big business. Sometimes there's an amorality to tech as well, and artists have a skill set and an IP within that. So actually there's a real challenge on the part of the cultural sector of how do we engage? We can adapt and learn from these other sectors, but how do we engage for them in a way that we're still protected, or we still have a kind of seat at the table. How do we make sure that we're not gatekeeping inequalities within the new emerging space? Like, how do we not replicate some of the mistakes we've made in physical environment in digital space? And yeah, can we get more comfortable with showing our workings out? And they're my final questions around digital practice, and I think I fit a lot into a small space of time, and that's it. Yeah, thank you.
Has anyone got any questions? Go for it.
Hello.
You said like how in 2013 there was like lots of projectors.
Yeah.
Certainly,
Like.
I see that a lot. Do you ever envision a time where there's no projectors, a digital art festival where there's not the projectors, and how long do you think that'll take?
No, because it's really interesting because they brought out that kind of AR projection, which sort of died really rapid death. And I'm trying to think. I think in the last 2 festivals we've had a projector. If we have, it's been really minimal.
Okay.
But I think one thing that's interesting is, and it kind of goes back to sort of like some of that 80s technology, is actually sometimes the advancement in one area makes a technology that wasn't available accessible. You know, something that was suddenly 500 quid becomes 100 quid, so then an artist has an opportunity to get their hands on it. So I think now there'll be this sort of array of defunct projectors. I think it's going to be really interesting of what the next iteration of that might look like, because it might not even be pointed at anything. I don't know. You might look inside it. I'll tell you though. I'll email you. So,
Yeah, I have a question. Because you mentioned that you're using agile methodology and rapid
yeah.
I was just thinking, how does that translate to traditional art audiences and traditional artists? Because I feel like there's a struggle there to get artists to go into digital because they're afraid of tech, just in general, and because they don't know the process of developing that. So is there a way of like, how would you approach that? How do you...
I don't think there's a kind of like one size fits all approach, because I think this is where like some of agile, like maybe your role as a producer is to kind of know some of that, but to think about that human-led approach. Because I know one example, we were working with a contemporary artist who was going into virtual reality for the first time and translating that practice along. So it's kind of being human focused in that sense, because there's a big risk and there's a big anxiety on the part of the artist, and I feel like part of our job as producers is to think about how we get them to that end product in a way that they're comfortable with.
Thank you.
Okay.
You mentioned about the testing, the prototyping stage, and like allowing artists and audiences to experiment.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have like have you set your own parameters for when that experimentation is over? Like how do you quantify the success? When is it finished?
It depends on the artwork. I think in terms of the festival and when we were commissioning and showing work, we had that, say, first exhibition period, and when we were working in a festival network, we had a chance to kind of take it to each festival. So that kind of, the exhibition period kind of defines the experimentation period, and then in terms of that iteration and development of the work, it depends what the needs of that next work is. It may be that in some ways by that point you've got it to like touring ready, but there's like engagement opportunities or ways that can inform how that work gets presented, or have, like, for example, in Grimsby we did a piece that used CCTV technologies and AI, and it translated movement into kind of poetry and oral history from the play. So one thing that work can do as it travels is work with community engagement and to change the content of that piece and to test with new audiences in that way so it's relevant to them. So, yeah, does that answer?
Yeah, I think so, because I was just wondering if there was a timeline you set, like, you know, your experiment's got to end now, or...
Maybe I should.
And also with, obviously with the technology changing all the time, different ways that we access information, whether that played a part in the experimentation, so maybe the concept of what the artist is wanting to do, is that allowed to grow with the emergence of new technologies? or?
Yeah, we would. I think we would hope so in that respect as well, because I think I think a lot of artists that we engage with have this kind of relationship to socially engaged practice as well. So in a lot of instances, they're kind of driven more by a purpose than a technology. So it may be that the work is trying to achieve something, that achieves something at an R&D test stage, but actually maybe the next stage, if we bring around like collaborators potentially around research and technology, that can help the artist sort of know the parameters of what's available and what that work could then look like. So I think it's human-led really. It's sort of one at a time.
I really like that intersection between the social change and then but using technology to do it. So are you using your festivals and technology around it in the way that people can view and interact with work as more like just an interface to these messages, like they could. Does that make sense? I don't know. I'm just rambling.
Yeah, I think so. I think the way that I think about it is like access points. You know, one of the things with digital technology, and I think one of the things in terms of democratic audience experience is when I produced a festival in Margate, it's weird, taxi drivers are such a good benchmark of place. And I had this taxi driver in Margate who found out when I was producing a festival there, just said, oh, it's not for me, love. And he became almost like a demographic in terms of users, like that it's not for me, love market. And he was really nice about it. But the integration of technology into public space kind of gives people an opportunity of what their access point is. Are they kind of culturally comfortable, or, you know, digital impacts every facet of our life? So actually, is the kind of invitation to touch or to play more inviting than the kind of concept of the work? Because then you get to the same end point of like a cultural engagement in place that's democratic and open to people.
So that digital technology, it's invasive now. So like we've got Leicester just had the digital billboards installed on like bus stops and stuff. You cannot help but see these screens changing and like images flashing and stuff. So yeah, I think it's really, I've not heard of your thing before, so thank you. I'm very interested to see.
Come see us.
So the word digital is a very complex one, because we use it in a sort of almost, some of us use it daily in a throwaway thing that we assume everyone understands what we mean. I sometimes think people think that digital is a bit like a sort of magic dust. You sprinkle a bit of digital in the project, it somehow turns it into something else. But I sort of think that there are at least two ways in which we use it, and often we don't realise which one we're using. One is that digital is a literacy. It's a way of doing stuff and enabling us as artists or whoever to do things perhaps in a better way, or certainly reach a bigger audience and use whatever. So it's like reading and writing, paint or drawing, or whatever. It's sort of a basic thing that helps us be creative, supports our creativity. But that is very different from the idea of digital being a medium. Because if you say, right, digital, this is a new way of doing stuff, so what does digital let us do that the previous media couldn't do? What is the special thing about digital that allows unique forms of art to be made? So there's that literacy versus medium sort of dichotomy. Is that something you engage with within Frequency, but generally within your practice and what you're doing?
Yeah, because I'd say especially more over the last couple of years, I'd say there's even more definitions of that, because the kind of more people you invite into the conversation, or the more people you invite to the space, the more definitions and relationships to that term digital you're bringing in. I was finding a lot of the times that if I was doing kind of talks, then I would have to start by defining my relationship to digital, because, for example, like Heritage Lottery Fund talk about a kind of digital upskilling. But when you look into that, they're talking about social media training and digital communications, and even that, there's a back-end infrastructure to that of like, now we've kind of moved away from office environments, there's a digital literacy in terms of how you organise your company, how you organise your scheduling. So the myriad of layers that digital kind of brings to something is part of, I think, why when I was thinking about this question, it feels so big, because I almost don't feel like digital is kind of a thing anymore. I feel like digital is more of a state. I went to a focus group with Queen's University and DCMS about policy and research framework around the metaverse. And that's where kind of this definition of the metaverse kind of came from. You know, people working in all these different environments, when we sat down together and said, well, what's the metaverse? It's like, well, to me it's this, to me it's that, to me it's this. Actually, the metaverse could almost talk about now our kind of entire relationship to digital, which if you think about from the minute you wake up in the morning, how many times you engage with digital, even like without digital practice being part of your career, we can't even put it into those two little pots anymore. It's almost like it's like smashing something on the floor and it crystallising into a million pieces.
The metaverse in particular, do you think that's more about marketing than actually about anything else?
No, I think it's about that. I think it's about kind of where we've hit sort of Web 2.0 and where we're moving into kind of Web 4 and further forwards, where we talk about that kind of subject-object relationship. Even if you think about artificial intelligence or kind of search engines or something like that, we've had a subject-object contract. And I think now as it moves forward, taking that kind of user-led message into account and thinking about kind of integration into day-to-day life, it's going to break down that fourth wall and become more of a sort of wraparound. So I think that's kind of the definition for me that I'm sitting with in terms of metaverse now. 2 months it'll probably change. Again, email me, check.
So a short follow-on. So if we accept this idea that if you use digital technology and you're an artist, it doesn't mean you're a digital artist. It means that you have digital literacy in your practice, which is important.
Yeah, because I think that. I don't hear many artists saying, I'm a digital artist. I hear an artist talk more about what they're trying to communicate or what they're trying to explore.
Yeah.
Because you wouldn't necessarily say, I'm a paint artist or anything like
Completely
that.
agree, yeah. What I was going to get onto is, do you think there is a thing called, for sake of description, digital art? And if so, does that have things in it that aren't in other art forms? What are its key affordances?
I think there was a term that was digital art when it was kind of in its inception. I don't think there is a term. I don't think there is digital art now. I think there is digital practice, but I think that actually relates more to kind of distribution than medium. But I definitely do, and you know, plugging our festival, I definitely do think digital culture exists and a relationship to digital culture. But again, it's that kind of fragmentation and that split, and I think
The first speaker, Francesca, mentioned the term computational art.
yeah.
And that is an intentionally used term to actually say the thing about the art isn't the computer, it's the process of computation. Is that a term that you recognise?
Yeah, I mean, really, I think in terms of when I think about the kind of, you know, the legacy that kind of Vera and the people that created, this kind of, that push towards the experimentation of the medium of like, what can this do? What's the parameters of this? I feel like there was a relationship, but it's also semantics, I think, because when you think back to what Joey was saying as well, and this kind of categorization of things, we've moved past that kind of postmodernist reference of individuality into like a metamodernist ultra individuality, and I think we're kind of moving past the sort of phase where we're going to create one term that we all adhere to. And I don't know if that's kind of the best use of our time in some ways, but I think it's interesting, but I would say I don't feel like digital art is a thing. I think everything's changing. We're in the future, guys. It's definitely happening.
Last question from G.
Yeah. It'll take about 25 minutes to preface this, but a very short question. How long has format frequency going? About 15 years, 12 years?
Since 2010, so 13 years?
13 years,
Yeah.
right? And it's formerly Lincoln-based, right?
It's Lincoln-based, yeah.
And geographically you can present to Lincoln.
Yes.
And then take those with them. So, the 15
No, it doesn't.
It does.
It's in Lincoln.
It's
and
always in
people-
Lincoln.
It's always been in
Everyone
Lincoln.
comes to Lincoln.
even better.
No one
Yeah.
goes, we don't take frequency out, even though we've been approached about it. If you want to see frequency, you come to Lincoln.
The green
Everyone, this is Asma. She works
Grimsby
with
is-
me, just so you know.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I got really upset.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Brilliant, even better. How more literate over the last 13 years has your Lincoln population become in terms of digital culture?
I think, again, it's that hyper-individuality, because I think we're thinking about it in relation to digital culture, but we hear these kind of quantitative stories, right? Qualitative, sorry, sometimes getting wrong. So we hear these qualitative stories, so like say in, we know that we've increased our engagement with over 60s audiences, and we've done that through kind of specifically programming in heritage sites. And we heard from this guy in like 2015 that he was watching a piece in Lincoln Cathedral, that he'd been coming to the festival from the previous year. but he didn't tell his wife because he didn't want to go with her. So he was kind of coming year on year. So he might not recognise it as a kind of relationship to digital, but he felt kind of a welcomeness and an openness in this festival that he wanted to, I mean, he was gatekeeping it, he wanted to sort of engage with year on year. So I think it's about that, you know, for me, a lot of it is that taxi driver, like how do you expand people's definition of like, it's not for me? Because also as well, if someone's saying it's not for me, is it because it's something they don't have a specific interest in? Is it something that they don't feel that they've been invited to or welcomed into?
Part of the preface would have been Arts Council's Let's Create Strategy and Relevance being one of the key components of the outcomes of which I know is one of the school outputs, and that's my favourite one. I always been arguing about relevance all the time. A lot of it is probably irrelevant, right?
Yeah.
And that's where a lot of people disengage. So if we're in this digital playground, digital, computerised, whatever we call it, it's kind of our duty as festival presenters and as arts producers to ensure that we're not just giving, phrases, we're not just ranking in public, it's not just a masturbatory exercise.
Yeah.
So I'm really, I'm almost guaranteed, I would almost guarantee that Lincoln kind of gets it more than a lot of other places do.
I mean,
I would expect that to be the case somehow.
because I guess because I haven't done it in another place, I couldn't sort of give you a sort of decent measure on that in that respect. But I think there's that element of R&D as well, and I think, like you say, it's not about sort of showing yourself up in public, but you have to get comfortable that some things are going to work and some things aren't, and actually by giving that audience an opportunity to kind of, you know, like, and that's in your infrastructure, you know, in where you prove your relevance, you can build that into your infrastructure. So our event hosts are kind of trained that, like, you're the frontline welcome to the festival, and if people want, you know, some people you'll know won't want to talk to you, you get that sense, but talk, you know, let us know what people are saying, kind of give us that feedback, and making sure that kind of festival has an opportunity there to engage with people, to be like, well, do you know what, that falls into that it's not for me. But also as well, our festival audiences, there are people who are engaged with culture, there are people, we have to think about the festival as an infrastructure that requires like a multitude of access points. So if you're coming to someone who's engaged with culture, you may be looking for a specific experience. If you're someone who is visiting place, you're going to look for an access point. So we have to kind of use this listening, use this qualitative relationship to think about our infrastructure and think about where we're mapping these access points.
I was just going to answer that. About the place actually, we assumed, this goes back to assumptions, that Lincoln is geared to culturally more savvy. I think that's the influence. And I think any place, and it's like the beauty about working in public space is it's a place where everybody is. And I say that generally. And when you're working on a festival, looking for example, frequency, we understand the communities that coalesce across the topography of the city. And there are, and I won't go into it now, but you know, that was the one thing that frequency came in and did, but no other thing did in place, which took a disparate set of people over here, down the hill, and a disparate lot of people up the hill. You can imagine, literally it is down the hill, up the hill, that socio-economic divide and kind of trying to smash that. And actually not only smash it, but actually when people from up there down here, and from, you know, that kind of like transfer. So the journey of the festival, and it continues to grow and to understand who are our demographics, where are we going, right down to programming work that we knew homeless people coalesced around us, even though the city wasn't happy about it, but we did it, and we managed to find those people and indeed go around, and that's a policy. But yeah, so to come to your point, absolutely, it's the responsibility of any place-based festival to kind of take on that responsibility 100%. So yeah.
Because my influence is that Lincoln should be, and is, I'm sure, an influence on this whole conversation around digital culture entirely internationally, somewhere along the line, at least DCM has done. And learning what it is that you guys are doing and how influential that can be, should be. My whole race of value is about raising value of the arts full stop.
Yeah.
And the arts aren't valued often internally in the arts. So yeah, I love the presentation, by the way.
Oh,
really
thank you.
comprehensive.
Oh, thanks. Cheers.